The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous song across the empty hallway of the 14th floor. It was 5:47 a.m., and Frank Miller was already there, pushing his cleaning cart with the same steady rhythm he had maintained for 20 years. His hands, weathered and marked by decades of silent work, gripped the mop handle with a firmness that belied his 80 years. No one noticed him. No one ever did. And that was exactly how it needed to be. Frank had become part of the architecture itself, a fixture as permanent and unremarkable as the water cooler or the emergency exit signs. Executives rushed past him without a glance. Interns avoided eye contact. Security guards nodded absently as he swiped his badge each morning at the same time. Every time. For 2 decades, Frank Miller had been invisible, and invisibility, he had learned long ago, was the most powerful armor a man could wear. But this morning, something was different. The new CEO had arrived 3 weeks earlier. His name was Derek Calloway, 34 years old, Harvard MBA, venture capital darling, and the kind of man who believed disruption was a virtue and tradition was a liability. He wore tailored suits that cost more than Frank's monthly pension, spoke in buzzwords that sounded like a foreign language, and had immediately begun what he called operational optimization. In plain English, that meant firing people. Frank had seen men like Derek before, young, hungry, convinced that the world owed them something simply because they had ambition. They moved through life like sharks, always forward, never pausing to consider what they left behind. Frank didn't judge them. He had learned long ago that judgment was a luxury he couldn't afford. But he watched them. He always watched. At 8:15 a.m., Frank was emptying the trash bins on the executive floor when Derek's assistant appeared in the doorway. She was young, nervous, clutching a tablet like a shield. "Mr. Miller." Her voice was apologetic before she even spoke the words. Frank straightened slowly, his back protesting the movement. He looked at her with calm, grey eyes that had seen things she couldn't imagine. "Yes, ma'am. Mr. Calloway would like to see you in his office. Now, please." Frank nodded. He had been expecting this. Not today, perhaps, but soon. He had watched the pattern unfold over the past 3 weeks. The closed-door meetings, the consultants with their clipboards and cold calculations, the way certain employees had begun to disappear from their desks. He knew what operational optimization meant for an 80-year-old janitor. He left his cart in the hallway and walked to the corner office with the same unhurried pace he brought to everything. Derek Calloway sat behind a glass desk that looked more like a piece of modern art than furniture. He didn't stand when Frank entered. He didn't offer a seat. He simply looked up from his laptop with the expression of a man performing an unpleasant but necessary task. "Frank, right?" Derek's tone was brisk, efficient, already moving on to the next item on his agenda. "Yes, sir. I'll get straight to the point. We're restructuring the facilities team, bringing in a contracted service that's more cost-effective and, frankly, more in line with our company culture. Younger, faster, more dynamic." He paused, as if waiting for Frank to react. When the old man simply stood there, calm and silent, Derek continued, "You've been here a long time. 20 years according to HR. That's impressive. But the reality is, we need people who can keep pace with where this company is going. You understand?" It wasn't a question. Frank nodded once. "I understand." Derek seemed almost disappointed by the lack of resistance. He had probably prepared arguments, justifications, maybe even rehearsed a speech about market forces and competitive pressures. But Frank offered him nothing to push against. "HR will process your final paycheck. You'll receive 2 weeks severance, which is more than generous given the circumstances. Derek's fingers were already moving back to his keyboard, the conversation over in his mind. "You can collect your things and leave today. Security will escort you out." "Yes, sir." Frank's voice was steady, empty of emotion. He had learned long ago how to keep everything locked away, buried so deep that even he sometimes forgot it was there. He turned and walked out of the office without another word. Behind him, Derek Calloway had already moved on to his next email, his next meeting, his next disruption. The old janitor was already forgotten. Frank returned to his cart and began collecting his few personal items. A thermos, a photograph in a small frame that he kept in the bottom drawer of his supply closet, a worn paperback novel he had been reading during lunch breaks. The photograph showed a much younger Frank, in a uniform that bore no insignia, standing beside 3 other men whose faces had been deliberately blurred. He looked at it for a long moment, then slipped it into his jacket pocket. By 9:30 a.m., Frank Miller was standing in the lobby, his belongings in a small cardboard box, waiting for the security guard to complete the exit paperwork. The morning rush of employees flowed around him like water around a stone. No one stopped. No one asked questions. He had been invisible for 20 years, and now he would simply cease to exist. The security guard, a young man named Marcus, who had always been polite to Frank, looked uncomfortable as he handed over the exit badge. "I'm sorry, Mr. Miller. I didn't know they were letting you go." Frank offered a small, tired smile. "It's all right, son. Things change. That's the way of the world." Marcus watched as the old man walked through the glass doors and out into the grey morning. There was something about the way he moved, straight-backed, deliberate, with a dignity that seemed out of place for a janitor being let go after 20 years. But Marcus shook off the thought and returned to his desk. He had his own problems to worry about. Frank stood on the sidewalk for a moment, feeling the cool October air on his face. The city moved around him with its usual indifference. Cars honking, people rushing, the constant hum of life that never paused, never looked back. He had lived in this city for 2 decades, and it had never once asked him who he really was. He began walking toward the bus stop, the cardboard box tucked under one arm. His apartment was 40 minutes away by public transit. It was small, sparsely furnished, the kind of place that suggested its occupant was either very poor or very temporary. In Frank's case, it had always been the latter, though he had stayed far longer than anyone had anticipated. As he waited for the bus, Frank thought about what came next. He had a small pension from his years of service that Derek Calloway knew nothing about, service that didn't appear on any resume or employment record. He would be fine. He had always been fine. Survival was a skill he had mastered long before he learned to push a mop. The bus arrived and Frank climbed aboard, taking a seat near the back. Through the window, he watched the office building recede into the distance. 20 years. It had been a good assignment, all things considered. Quiet, safe, boring even. And boring, he had learned, was a gift. Back in the glass tower, Derek Calloway was in the middle of a video conference with investors when his desk phone rang. He glanced at it with irritation. His assistant knew better than to interrupt during investor calls. He ignored it and continued his presentation about projected growth and market disruption. The phone rang again and again. Derek muted his microphone and jabbed the intercom button. "I'm in a meeting. Take a message." His assistant's voice came back, tight with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. "Sir, they said it's urgent. They said it's about Frank Miller." Derek's jaw tightened. "Tell whoever it is that Mr. Miller no longer works here. HR can handle any final paperwork." "Sir, it's not HR, She paused, and Derek could hear muffled voices in the background. They said they're calling from the Department of Defense, the Pentagon specifically. For the first time that morning, Derek Calloway felt something cold settle in his stomach. He stared at the phone as if it had suddenly become a live grenade. "Put them through," he said quietly. He unmuted his microphone long enough to tell the investors there was an urgent matter that required his immediate attention, then ended the call. The phone on his desk rang once more, and he picked it up with a hand that was no longer quite steady. "This is Derek Calloway." The voice on the other end was male, clipped and carried the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. "Mr. Calloway, this is Colonel James Hendricks, United States Department of Defense, Special Operations Division. I'm calling regarding one of your employees, or rather, a former employee as of approximately 45 minutes ago, Franklin James Miller." Derek's mind raced. Yes. Mr. Miller was let go this morning as part of a restructuring. I'm not sure why the Department of Defense would be. "Mr. Calloway." The Colonel's voice cut through his words like a blade. "I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. Do not interrupt. Do not ask questions until I'm finished. Do you understand?" "Yes." Derek's mouth had gone dry. "Franklin Miller has been under federal protection for the past 22 years. He is a critical intelligence asset whose testimony was instrumental in dismantling 3 international espionage networks and preventing multiple acts of domestic terrorism. His placement at your company was not coincidental. It was arranged through a classified program that provides protected witnesses with stable, low-profile employment while maintaining their security. Your company has been receiving federal subsidies for the past 2 decades, specifically to keep Mr. Miller employed and safe." Derek felt the room tilt slightly. I didn't know. There was nothing in his file. No one told me." "You weren't supposed to know," Colonel Hendricks continued, his voice hardening. "The entire point of witness protection is that it remains invisible. Mr. Miller's identity, his location, his employment, all of it was classified at the highest level. Your predecessor understood this arrangement. Apparently, that information was not properly transferred during the transition." "I had no idea," Derek repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "His file just showed he was a janitor. 20 years, standard employment. There was nothing. There wouldn't be. That's the point." The Colonel's patience was clearly wearing thin. "Mr. Calloway, do you understand the severity of what you've just done? By terminating Mr. Miller's employment, you have compromised a protected witness. You have violated federal security protocols, and you have potentially exposed a man who has enemies in 7 countries, some of whom would very much like to see him dead." The cold feeling in Derek's stomach had spread to his entire body. He thought about the casual way he had dismissed Frank Miller, the efficiency with which he had eliminated what he thought was dead weight. An 80-year-old janitor. Slow, outdated, expendable. What do I need to do?" Derek asked, hating the way his voice shook. "Right now, you need to tell me exactly where Mr. Miller is. We have a security team en route to your location, but we need to locate him immediately. He left about 30 minutes ago. I don't know where he went. His home address should be in HR. We have his address. We have every detail of his life for the past 22 years, Mr. Calloway. What we don't have is confirmation of his current location, and that's a problem." There was a pause, and Derek could hear muted voices in the background, rapid exchanges that sounded like commands. "Stand by." Derek stood frozen, the phone pressed to his ear, listening to the silence. Through his office window, he could see the city continuing its normal rhythm, unaware that anything had changed. But everything had changed. In the span of 10 minutes, His entire understanding of reality had been upended. The Colonel's voice returned. "Mr. Calloway, I need you to remain in your office. A federal security team will be arriving at your location within the next 8 minutes. They will need to speak with you, review your security protocols, and assess any potential breach. Do not leave the building. Do not discuss this conversation with anyone. Is that clear?" "Yes, perfectly clear. One more thing." The Colonel's voice dropped, taking on a tone that made Derek's blood run cold. "If anything happens to Frank Miller as a result of your actions today, you will be held personally responsible. And I can assure you, Mr. Calloway, that is not a situation you want to find yourself in." The line went dead. Derek slowly lowered the phone, his hand trembling. He sank into his chair and stared at the glass surface of his desk, seeing his own reflection staring back at him. Young, successful, confident, or at least he had been confident an hour ago. Now he felt like a child who had just realized he was playing with something far more dangerous than he understood. His assistant's voice crackled over the intercom. "Mr. Calloway, there are vehicles outside, black SUVs, and men in suits. They're coming into the building." Derek closed his eyes. "Let them up and clear my schedule for the rest of the day. All of it, all of it. If you believe every life holds a story worth remembering, subscribe to this channel and join our community." Frank Miller sat in his small apartment, the cardboard box on the kitchen table, and made himself a cup of coffee. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had seen better decades. The furniture was minimal, a couch that had come with the place, a small television that he rarely watched, a bed, a table with 2 chairs. There were no photographs on the walls, no personal mementos, nothing that suggested a life lived beyond these 4 walls. He had learned long ago not to accumulate things. Things created attachments, and attachments created vulnerabilities. For 22 years, he had lived like a ghost, present but not really there, existing in the margins of other people's lives. It had been necessary. It had kept him alive. But there were moments, usually in the quiet hours of early morning or late evening, when he wondered what it would have been like to live differently. He took his coffee to the window and looked out at the street below. It was a Thursday morning, which meant the neighborhood was relatively quiet. The working people had already left for their jobs. The retired folks were settling into their daily routines. Life continued its predictable patterns, indifferent to the small dramas that played out within it. Frank thought about Derek Calloway and felt nothing resembling anger. The young CEO had done what young CEOs do, made decisions based on spreadsheets and efficiency models, seeing people as resources to be optimized rather than lives to be respected. Frank had encountered countless men like him over the years, in various uniforms and various contexts. They were a type, predictable and ultimately forgettable. What Frank did feel, surprisingly, was a sense of relief. 20 years was a long time to maintain a cover. 20 years of being invisible, of swallowing his pride, of pretending to be less than he was. It had been necessary, and he had done it without complaint. But it had also been exhausting in ways that had nothing to do with physical labor. He was 80 years old. He had earned the right to be tired. His phone rang, the secure line, not the regular cell phone he used for ordinary life. Frank looked at it for a long moment before answering. He knew who it would be, Miller. His voice was calm, professional, slipping back into the tone he had used in another life. "Frank, it's Hendricks. We have a situation. I figured as much when I got let go this morning." Frank took a sip of his coffee. The new CEO didn't know about the arrangement. That's putting it mildly. He's currently being debriefed by a very unhappy security team. But that's not why I'm calling. Colonel Hendricks paused, and Frank could hear the concern in his voice. "We need to move you. Today, the termination created a gap in your security profile. If anyone's been watching, they'll notice the change in pattern." Frank had already considered this. "I understand. Where?" "We're working on that. There's a facility in Montana, completely off-grid, or we can arrange international relocation if you prefer. Europe, maybe. Australia. You'd have a new identity, new background, the full package." Frank looked around his small apartment, at the life he had built from nothing and maintained for 2 decades. It wasn't much, but it was his. Or at least it had been his for a while. "How long do I have?" "Teams en route to your location now. 20 minutes, maybe less. Pack light. We'll handle everything else." "Understood." Frank was about to hang up when Hendricks spoke again. "Frank, I'm sorry. You deserved better than this. You deserved better than all of it." Frank smiled, though there was no humor in it. "I'm alive, Jim. That's more than a lot of good men can say. I'll take it." He ended the call and stood for a moment, coffee cup in hand, looking at the life he was about to leave behind. Then he set the cup down and began to pack. In the glass tower downtown, Derek Calloway sat in his office, surrounded by federal agents who looked at him with expressions ranging from professional disdain to barely concealed contempt. The lead agent, a woman named Sarah Chen, who introduced herself as being from an agency she didn't name, had been questioning him for the past 40 minutes. "Walk me through the decision again," Agent Chen said, her pen poised over a notepad. "What specifically made you decide to terminate Mr. Miller's employment?" Derek had already explained this 3 times, but he did so again, his voice growing more hollow with each repetition. "We were restructuring the facilities department, bringing in a contracted service. It was a cost-saving measure. Miller was the oldest employee in that division, and his performance metrics..." "Performance metrics," Agent Chen repeated, her tone flat. "You fired an 80-year-old man because of performance metrics." "I didn't know," Derek said for what felt like the 100th time. There was nothing in his file, nothing in the transition documents from the previous CEO. How was I supposed to know he was under federal protection? "You weren't," Agent Chen admitted. "That's the point of protection. But what you were supposed to do, Mr. Calloway, was exercise basic human decency. Frank Miller had been with this company for 20 years. 20 years of showing up every day, doing his job, never causing problems, never asking for anything. And you dismissed him like he was a line item on a budget report." Derek felt his face flush. "I was doing my job. I was hired to make this company more efficient, more competitive. And in the process, you potentially endangered a man who has spent the last 2 decades in hiding because he had the courage to testify against people who would kill him without hesitation." Agent Chen closed her notepad with a sharp snap. "Congratulations, Mr. Calloway. You've optimized yourself into a federal investigation." One of the other agents, a tall man with a military bearing, stepped forward. "We need access to your security footage for the past 6 months. All of it. We need to know if anyone has been surveilling this building, if there have been any unusual visitors, any patterns that might suggest Miller's cover was compromised before today." Derek nodded numbly. "Of course, whatever you need. We'll also need a list of everyone who had access to employee records. Anyone who might have seen Miller's file, his schedule, his personal information. That would be most of the HR department. And the previous CEO, and probably some of the senior management team." Agent Chen exchanged a look with her colleague. "Get me that list, now." As Derek reached for his phone to call HR, his assistant's voice came over the intercom again, more frantic this time. "Mr. Calloway, there's someone here from the board of directors. They're demanding to know why there are federal agents in the building. and the press is starting to gather outside. Someone must have seen the vehicles." Derek closed his eyes. His carefully planned disruption, his bold new vision for the company, his entire strategy for success, all of it was crumbling in real time. And at the center of it all was an 80-year-old janitor he had dismissed without a second thought. "Tell the board I'll brief them as soon as possible," he said quietly. "And tell the press. Tell them nothing. Refer all questions to our legal department." Agent Chen was watching him with an expression that might have been pity if it weren't mixed with such obvious disappointment. "Mr. Calloway, I want you to understand something. Frank Miller is a man who sacrificed everything, his identity, his freedom, his entire life, to do the right thing. He testified against people who were selling classified information to hostile governments. He helped prevent attacks that would have killed hundreds, maybe thousands of people. And for the past 22 years, he's lived in hiding, always looking over his shoulder, never able to contact his family, never able to be himself, all because he chose to serve his country when it mattered most." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "And you fired him because he was old and slow, because he didn't fit your vision of what a modern, dynamic company should look like. I want you to think about that, Mr. Calloway. I want you to think about what that says about your values, your judgment, and your fitness to lead anything more significant than a lemonade stand." Derek had no response. What could he possibly say? She was right about all of it. The tall agent's phone buzzed, and he stepped away to take the call. When he returned, his expression was grim. "Miller's secure. Team has him in transit to a safe location. But we've got a problem. Someone accessed the company's employee database from an external IP address approximately 2 hours ago. They pulled Miller's file, including his home address." The room went very quiet. Agent Chen stood slowly. When was the termination processed through the system? Derek felt his stomach drop. "This morning, around 9. HR would have updated his status immediately, so anyone monitoring the database would have seen that his employment status changed. They would have known his protection was compromised." Agent Chen's jaw tightened. "We need to lock down this entire building. No one in or out until we clear every employee and visitor, and I need to know who had the access codes to that database." Derek's hands were shaking now. "That would be. It has full access. HR has partial access. Some of the senior management team has read-only access for reporting purposes. Get me names, all of them, and I need your IT department up here now." As agents began moving with sudden urgency, Derek sat frozen in his chair, watching his world collapse around him. He thought about Frank Miller, a man he had seen every day for 3 weeks and never thoroughly looked at, a man whose entire existence he had dismissed as irrelevant. And now that man was at the center of a federal security crisis, and Derek was responsible. His phone buzzed with incoming messages. The board, investors, the press. Everyone wanted answers, explanations, assurances, but Derek had none to give. He had been so certain of his vision, so confident in his ability to transform the company, to disrupt the old ways and bring in the new. And in his arrogance, he had never stopped to consider that maybe, just maybe, there were things he didn't understand, people he didn't see, stories he didn't know. Agent Chen was on her phone, speaking in rapid, clipped sentences. When she finished, she turned back to Derek with an expression that made him feel like a child being scolded by a disappointed parent. "Mr. Calloway, I'm going to be very clear with you. If Frank Miller is harmed because of the security breach that occurred under your watch, you will face federal charges, obstruction of justice, endangering a protected witness, possibly accessory to whatever happens to him. Do you understand the severity of this situation?" "Yes." Derek's voice was barely a whisper. I don't think you do, but you will. Frank Miller sat in the back of an unmarked SUV, watching the city slide past through tinted windows. There were 2 agents in the front seat, both young enough to be his grandchildren, both carrying themselves with the careful alertness of people trained to see threats everywhere. They had been polite when they arrived at his apartment, efficient as they swept the space for any surveillance devices, gentle as they escorted him to the vehicle. He had been through this before, not the extraction itself, that was new, but the feeling of being uprooted, of having to leave behind whatever small life he had managed to build. It was a familiar ache, one he had learned to carry without letting it show. "Where are we headed?" Frank asked, more out of habit than genuine curiosity. The agent in the passenger seat glanced back. "Secure facility outside the city. You'll be debriefed there, and then we'll discuss next steps. Colonel Hendricks will meet you there." Frank nodded. He had known Jim Hendricks for over 2 decades. They had been through the worst of it together. The testimony, the threats, the long nights of relocation and identity construction. Jim had been a young captain then, ambitious and idealistic, convinced that the system could protect people who did the right thing. Frank wondered if he still believed that. The SUV merged onto the highway, joining the flow of traffic heading out of the city. Frank watched the buildings give way to suburbs, then to stretches of industrial parks and empty lots. He thought about the life he was leaving behind, the small apartment, the quiet routine, the invisibility that had become both his prison and his sanctuary. And he thought about Derek Calloway, the young CEO who had fired him without a second thought. Frank didn't hate him. Hate required energy, and Frank had learned to conserve his energy for things that mattered. But he did feel a kind of sad recognition. Derek was a type he had encountered many times. People who moved through the world convinced of their own importance, never pausing to consider the stories of those around them. They weren't evil. They were just blind. And blindness, Frank had learned, could be just as dangerous as malice. His phone buzzed. The regular one, not the secure line. Frank pulled it out and saw a message from Marcus, the security guard from the office building. "Mr. Miller, I don't know what's going on, but there are federal agents everywhere, and they're asking about you. I hope you're okay. You were always kind to me. Thank you for that." Frank stared at the message for a long moment. In 20 years, he had tried so hard to remain invisible, to avoid forming connections, to keep everyone at a safe distance. But apparently, even in invisibility, small kindnesses had been noticed. Small moments had mattered. He typed a brief response. "I'm fine, Marcus. Thank you for your concern. Be well." Then he turned off the phone and handed it to the agent in the passenger seat. "You'll want to dispose of this. Standard protocol." The agent took it without comment, already knowing the procedure. They drove in silence for another 20 minutes before turning off the highway onto a series of back roads that wound through increasingly rural landscape. Frank recognized the pattern. They were taking an indirect route, making sure they weren't being followed, creating distance between his old life and whatever came next. Finally, they pulled up to what looked like an abandoned warehouse, though Frank's trained eye caught the subtle signs of active security, cameras disguised as weathered fixtures, reinforced doors that looked old but weren't, the slight shimmer of bulletproof glass in windows that appeared broken. Colonel James Hendricks was waiting inside. He had aged in the years since Frank had last seen him, more grey in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes, but he still carried himself with the same military precision. When he saw Frank, something in his expression softened. "Frank, it's good to see you. I just wish it were under better circumstances." Frank shook his hand. "Could be worse, Jim. I'm still breathing. Barely, thanks to that idiot CEO. Hendricks gestured toward a small office space that had been set up in the corner of the warehouse. "We need to talk about what happens next." They sat across from each other at a metal table that had seen better days. Hendricks pulled out a file. "Actual paper," Frank noted, "not digital," and opened it. "First things first. We've secured your apartment and swept it for any surveillance. Clean. Whoever accessed your file from the company database didn't have time to act on it before we moved you. You're safe. For now." "For now?" Frank repeated. "What about long term?" Hendricks leaned back in his chair. "That's what we need to discuss. You have options. We can relocate you again. New city, new identity, new life. We can set you up with another protected employment situation. Though obviously we'll be more careful about the transition protocols this time. Or," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "or we can consider that you've been in protection for 22 years. The original threats against you are significantly diminished. Most of the people who wanted you dead are either in prison or dead themselves. We could potentially end the protection and let you live openly." Frank absorbed this. "Openly? With my real name, my real identity? Yes, it would come with risks. There are still people out there who remember what you did, who might hold grudges. But the immediate active threats are largely neutralized. You'd be free, as free as anyone can be after what you've been through. Free." Frank turned the word over in his mind. He had been Frank Miller for 20 years, but before that, he had been someone else. Someone with a family, a history, a life that belonged to him. That person had been erased, buried under layers of false identities and fabricated histories. The idea of resurrecting him after all this time felt both terrifying and impossibly appealing. "What would that look like?" Frank asked quietly. "We'd provide security consultation, help you establish yourself somewhere safe. You'd have access to your original identity, your service records, your pension from your actual career. You could contact family if any are still alive. You could live, Frank. Really live, not just survive." Frank thought about his daughter. She would be in her 50s now, if she was still alive. The last time he had seen her, she was 28, newly married, pregnant with her first child. He had missed everything: the birth of his grandchildren, their childhoods, their lives. She thought he was dead. The official story had been a car accident, a closed casket, a quiet funeral. It had been necessary to protect her, to keep her safe from the people who wanted to hurt him. But 22 years was a long time to be dead. "I need to think about it," Frank said finally. Hendricks nodded. "Take your time. You've earned that much. In the meantime, you'll stay here. We have secure quarters set up, everything you need." And Frank? He met the older man's eyes. "I'm sorry. You deserved better than what happened today. You deserved better than all of it." Frank offered a small smile. "I'm alive, Jim. That's more than a lot of good men can say." Derek Calloway stood in front of the board of directors, feeling like a man facing a firing squad. The emergency meeting had been called within hours of the federal agent's arrival, and the mood in the room was somewhere between furious and panicked. The chairman, a silver-haired man named Robert Thornton, who had been with the company for 40 years, spoke with barely controlled anger. "Let me see if I understand this correctly. You fired an employee who was under federal witness protection, an employee whose presence here was part of a classified government program, an employee whose safety was our legal responsibility? Is that accurate?" "Yes, sir." Derek's voice was steady, but inside he was screaming. "I was not informed of the arrangement during the transition. There was nothing in the employee files, nothing in the documentation from the previous CEO, because it was classified." Another board member, a woman named Patricia Vance, cut him off. "The entire point of witness protection is that it remains invisible. The previous CEO understood this. He maintained the arrangement for 2 decades without incident, and you destroyed it in 3 weeks. Derek wanted to defend himself, to explain that he had been hired to make tough decisions, to streamline operations, to increase efficiency. But even as the words formed in his mind, he realized how hollow they sounded. He had been so focused on the numbers, on the metrics, on the vision of what the company could become, that he had failed to see what it already was. A place where people worked, where lives intersected, where stories unfolded in ways that couldn't be captured on a spreadsheet. The federal investigation is ongoing, Derek said quietly. They're reviewing our security protocols, our employee database access, everything. Agent Chen indicated that if Mr. Miller is harmed as a result of the security breach, there could be criminal charges. The room fell silent. Criminal charges. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Robert Thornton closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked every one of his 73 years. This company has been in operation for 68 years. We've survived recessions, market crashes, hostile takeovers. We've built a reputation for integrity and stability. And in 3 weeks, you've managed to put all of that at risk. I take full responsibility, Derek said, though the words felt inadequate. Full responsibility. Patricia Vance laughed, but there was no humor in it. Do you even understand what that means? Frank Miller is a man who sacrificed everything to serve his country. He lived in hiding for over 2 decades, gave up his identity, his family, his entire life, and we were entrusted with his safety. That was our responsibility, Mr. Calloway, and you failed him. You failed all of us. Derek had no response. What could he possibly say? The board discussed his fate in low, tense voices. Derek stood there, listening to his career dissolve in real time, and thought about Frank Miller. He tried to remember if he had ever really looked at the old man, ever seen him as anything more than a line item on an efficiency report. He couldn't recall a single conversation, a single moment of genuine human connection. Frank Miller had been invisible to him, and Derek had never thought to question why. Finally, Robert Thornton spoke. Mr. Calloway, the board has decided to place you on immediate administrative leave pending the outcome of the federal investigation. If charges are filed, your employment will be terminated. If charges are not filed, we will revisit your status at that time. But I want to be clear, your actions today have severely damaged this company's reputation and potentially endangered a man's life. That is not the kind of leadership we value. Derek nodded. I understand. I hope you do. I truly hope you do. 3 days passed in the secure facility. Frank Miller spent them in a kind of limbo, not quite free, not quite imprisoned, existing in the strange space between identities. He read books from the small library the facility maintained, walked the perimeter of the secured grounds under the watchful eyes of agents, and thought about what came next. On the 4th morning, Colonel Hendricks returned with news. We've made progress on the security breach, he said, settling into the chair across from Frank in the small dining area. The external access to the company database came from a cyber cafe in Newark. Paid in cash, no surveillance footage that's useful. Whoever it was knew what they were doing. Frank absorbed this calmly. So, they're still out there, possibly, or it could have been opportunistic. Someone monitoring corporate databases for valuable information stumbled onto your file, didn't know what they had. Hendricks paused. But we can't assume that. We have to operate as if your cover is fully compromised, which means relocation. Frank's voice was flat, resigned. Not necessarily. Hendricks pulled out a tablet and slid it across the table. There's another option. we've been tracking the remaining members of the Volkov network, the organization you testified against 22 years ago. In the past 3 years, the last of the leadership has either died or been imprisoned. The foot soldiers who might have remembered you are scattered, most of them out of the game entirely. The threat level has dropped to minimal. Frank looked at the tablet, scanning the intelligence report. Names he recognized, faces that had haunted his nightmares for decades, all marked with red stamps. Deceased, incarcerated, neutralized. You're saying I could go public, use my real name, live openly? With precautions, yes. We'd set you up with security consultation, regular check-ins, monitoring of any potential threats. But Frank, the world has moved on. The people who wanted you dead are gone. You've served your time in the shadows. You've earned the right to step back into the light. Frank set down the tablet and looked out the window at the grey morning. 22 years. He had been Franklin James Miller, janitor, for 22 years. Before that, he had been someone else entirely. A man with a different name, a different life, a different purpose. That man had made a choice to testify, knowing what it would cost him, and it had cost him everything. But that man had also been a father, a husband once, before cancer took his wife, a grandfather, though he had never met his grandchildren, a person with roots, with history, with connections that mattered. "My daughter," Frank said quietly. "Sarah, is she?" Hendricks nodded. "Alive, living in Portland, Oregon. She's a high school teacher, married, 3 kids, your grandchildren. They're grown now, in their 20s. She never remarried after her husband died 8 years ago." He paused. "She thinks you're dead, Frank. She's thought that for 22 years. If you choose to come back, that's going to be complicated." Frank closed his eyes. He imagined walking up to his daughter's door, knocking, seeing her face when she realized her father, dead for over 2 decades, was standing in front of her. The shock, the disbelief, the anger probably at the years stolen from them, the life they could have had together, erased by necessity and secrecy. "Would she even want to see me?" Frank asked, his voice rough with emotion he rarely allowed himself to feel. "I can't answer that, but she deserves the chance to decide, and you deserve the chance to be yourself again." Frank sat in silence for a long time, wrestling with a decision that felt too large to contain. Finally, he spoke. "What about Calloway, the CEO? What's happened to him?" Hendricks's expression hardened. "He's on administrative leave. The board is waiting to see if federal charges will be filed. The company is in full damage control mode. Press releases about security reviews, consultants brought in to assess protocols, the whole circus. Calloway's career is effectively over, whether charges are filed or not." "He didn't know," Frank said, "about the arrangement, about who I was." "No, he didn't, but he also didn't care. He saw an old man and decided he was expendable. That's not illegal, but it's sure as hell immoral." Hendricks leaned forward. "Frank, you don't owe that man anything. He threw you away like garbage without a second thought." "I know." Frank's voice was quiet but firm. "But I also know what it's like to make a decision that changes everything, to do something you can't take back. He's young, arrogant, blind to anything that doesn't fit his worldview. But he's not evil. He's just human, flawed and human." Hendricks shook his head, a slight smile on his face. "After everything you've been through, you still have compassion for people who don't deserve it. That's either wisdom or insanity, Frank. I'm not sure which. Maybe both," Frank said, returning the smile. They sat together in comfortable silence, 2 men who had shared too many secrets and too many years to need constant conversation. Finally, Frank spoke again. "I want to see her, Sarah. I want to meet my grandchildren. I want to stop being a ghost." He looked at Hendricks with eyes that held both hope and fear. "But I need to do something first. I need to go back to that office. I need to talk to Calloway." Hendricks frowned. "Frank, that's not a good idea. The security situation is minimal threat, according to your own report. And I need to do this, Jim. That young man made a mistake, and it's going to haunt him for the rest of his life unless someone tells him it's okay to be human. I can do that. I need to do that." "You're a better man than I am," Hendricks said finally. "All right, I'll arrange it. But you go in with a security detail, and you don't stay long. Agreed?" "Agreed." 2 days later, Frank Miller walked back into the glass tower downtown, flanked by 2 federal agents who tried very hard to look like ordinary businessmen and failed completely. The lobby security guard, Marcus, nearly dropped his coffee when he saw him. "Mr. Miller, I thought everyone said you were—" Marcus couldn't finish the sentence. Frank offered him a warm smile. "I'm fine, son. Everything's fine. I just need to speak with Mr. Calloway." Marcus nodded, still looking stunned, and made the call upstairs. 5 minutes later, Frank was in the elevator, riding up to the executive floor he had cleaned for 20 years, but never truly inhabited. Derek Calloway was standing in his office when Frank arrived, and the young CEO looked like he had aged a decade in less than a week. His suit was rumpled, his tie loosened, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion, and something that looked like shame. "Mr. Miller," Derek's voice was hoarse, I don't know what to say." Frank dismissed the agents with a nod, and they stepped outside, closing the door but remaining visible through the glass walls. Then he turned to Derek and spoke with a gentleness that surprised them both. "You don't need to say anything. I'm not here for an apology. You should be. You deserve one. You deserve a lot more than that." Derek sank into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him. "I destroyed your life. I put you in danger. I was so focused on efficiency and optimization and all the buzzwords they taught me in business school that I forgot you were a person, a human being with a story and a life that mattered." Frank pulled up a chair and sat down, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who had learned to conserve his energy. "You made a mistake, a bad one, but you didn't destroy my life, Mr. Calloway. You disrupted it, certainly. You created complications that will take time to resolve. But my life was destroyed a long time ago when I made the choice to testify against people who were selling my country's secrets to the highest bidder. What you did was inconvenient, painful even, but not fatal." Derek looked at him with an expression of profound confusion. "How can you be so calm about this? I fired you. I compromised your security. I treated you like you were nothing, because I've learned that anger is exhausting, and I'm too old to waste energy on it." Frank leaned back in his chair. "You want to know who I really am? Who I was before I became the invisible janitor?" Derek nodded, unable to speak. "I was a signals intelligence analyst for the Defense Intelligence Agency. I spent 30 years intercepting and decoding communications from hostile governments. I was good at my job, very good, and one day I discovered that someone in our own organization was selling classified information to a Russian intelligence network. Not just low-level stuff, strategic military plans, names of undercover operatives, information that got people killed." Frank's voice remained steady, but his eyes held memories that Derek couldn't begin to imagine. "I had a choice. I could report it and become a target, or I could stay quiet and keep my comfortable life. I chose to report it. I testified. I helped dismantle an espionage network that had been operating for over a decade, and in return, I lost everything. My identity, my family, my entire existence. I became Frank Miller, janitor, and I lived in the shadows for 22 years. Derek's hands were shaking. I had no idea. There was nothing in your file. There wasn't supposed to be. That was the point. I was hidden in plain sight, invisible by design. And you know what? It worked. For 20 years, it worked perfectly. I was safe. I was alive. I had a routine, a purpose, even if that purpose was just pushing a mop and emptying trash cans. Frank paused, his expression softening. You didn't destroy that, Mr. Calloway. You ended it. And maybe it was time for it to end. But the security breach is being handled. The threats against me are minimal now. Most of the people who wanted me dead are gone. I'm being given a choice I never thought I'd have. The chance to reclaim my real identity, to reconnect with my family, to stop being a ghost. Frank met Derek's eyes directly. You didn't mean to give me that gift, but in a strange way, you did. Derek shook his head slowly. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Probably not, Frank agreed, and there was a hint of humor in his voice. But I'm giving it to you anyway, not because you've earned it, but because I've learned that holding on to resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It doesn't work. It just makes you sick. They sat in silence for a moment, the young CEO and the old veteran, separated by decades and experiences, but connected by this strange, painful moment of truth. Finally, Derek spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. What do I do now? How do I move forward from this? Frank considered the question carefully. You learn. You remember that every person you encounter has a story you don't know, a life you can't see, a dignity that deserves respect, regardless of their job title, or their age, or their usefulness to your bottom line. You stop seeing people as resources to be optimized, and start seeing them as human beings to be valued. That's not what they teach you in business school, Derek said with a bitter laugh. No, it's not, but it's what life teaches you if you're paying attention. Frank stood slowly, his joints protesting the movement. You're young, Mr. Calloway. You have time to become a better man than you are today. Don't waste it. Derek rose as well, extending his hand. Frank shook it, feeling the tremor in the younger man's grip, seeing the tears that Derek was trying very hard not to shed. Thank you, Derek said, for coming here, for telling me your story, for not hating me. I don't hate you. I just hope you'll do better. Frank turned toward the door, then paused and looked back. One more thing. That security guard downstairs, Marcus. He was kind to me. Small kindnesses, nothing dramatic, but they mattered. When you're rebuilding this company, rebuilding yourself, remember that. The small kindnesses matter. Then Frank Miller walked out of the office, flanked by his federal escorts, leaving Derek Calloway standing alone in his glass tower with a view of the city and a weight of understanding he hadn't possessed a week earlier. If this story touched your heart, click like and subscribe to honor those who served. As Frank rode the elevator down, he felt something shift inside him, a loosening of tension he had carried for so long, he had forgotten it was there. He had spent 22 years being invisible, being less than he was, hiding from a past that had finally, mercifully, begun to fade. And now, for the first time in decades, he could imagine a future that belonged to him. The agents escorted him back to the SUV, and as they pulled away from the building, Frank looked back one last time at the place that had been his prison and his sanctuary for 2 decades. He didn't feel anger or regret. He felt something closer to gratitude. It had kept him alive. It had kept him safe. And now it was time to let it go. Colonel Hendricks was waiting at the secure facility when they returned. He took one look at Frank's face and smiled. You talked to him? I did. And? And he's young and foolish and arrogant, but he's not beyond redemption. None of us are. Frank settled into a chair in the debriefing room. I've made my decision, Jim. I want to go home. My real home. I want to see my daughter. Hendricks nodded, pulling out a file. I thought you might say that. We've already begun the process. We'll coordinate with the Portland field office, arrange for a secure introduction, provide counseling support for both you and Sarah. This is going to be difficult, Frank. She's going to have questions. She's going to be angry, probably. Hurt, definitely. 22 years is a long time to mourn someone who wasn't actually dead. I know, but I owe her the truth. I owe her the chance to know her father, even if that father is an old man with more past than future. Frank's voice was steady, but his hands trembled slightly. When can we do this? We need 2 weeks to set everything up properly. Make sure the security is airtight. Prepare Sarah for the shock. Arrange for professional support. This isn't something we can rush. Hendricks leaned forward. Are you sure about this? Once you step out of the shadows, there's no going back. You'll be visible again, vulnerable in ways you haven't been for decades. I'm sure. I've been dead long enough, Jim. It's time to live. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparation. Frank met with counselors who specialized in witness protection reunifications. He reviewed security protocols. He wrote and rewrote a letter to his daughter, trying to find words that could possibly explain 22 years of absence. 22 years of letting her believe he was dead. Every version felt inadequate, but he kept trying. Meanwhile, in Portland, federal agents were carefully approaching Sarah Mitchell, formerly Sarah Miller, to prepare her for the impossible. Her father, dead for over 2 decades, was alive, and he wanted to see her. Colonel Hendricks showed Frank the video of that conversation. Sarah, a woman in her early 50s with her father's grey eyes and her mother's gentle smile, sat in her living room surrounded by agents who were trying to deliver the most surreal news imaginable. Frank watched as disbelief gave way to shock, shock gave way to tears, and tears gave way to a complicated mixture of joy and anger and confusion that he understood completely. She wants to see you, Hendricks said quietly, but she needs time to process this. She needs to tell her children, prepare herself emotionally. We're looking at another week before the actual reunion. Frank nodded, his own eyes damp. She looks like her mother. My God, she looks just like Catherine. She's a good woman, Frank. Strong. Her students love her. Her kids are proud of her. She built a good life, even with the grief of losing you. Hendricks paused. She deserves to know why. Why you let her think you were dead. Why you never reached out, never sent a message, never gave her any sign you were alive. I know, and I'll tell her everything, every painful detail. She deserves that much. Back in the city, Derek Calloway was living through his own reckoning. The board had officially terminated his employment, citing gross negligence and failure to maintain critical security protocols. The press had gotten hold of the story, not the classified details, but enough to paint a picture of a young, arrogant CEO who had fired a protected federal witness and triggered a security crisis. Derek's phone rang constantly with calls from headhunters telling him his career in executive leadership was over, from lawyers advising him on potential criminal charges, from former colleagues distancing themselves from the scandal. His carefully constructed life was in ruins, and he had no one to blame but himself. But something had changed in Derek after Frank's visit. The old man's words had burrowed into his consciousness, forcing him to confront truths he had spent his entire career avoiding. He had treated people as resources, as numbers on a spreadsheet, as obstacles to efficiency. He had never stopped to consider their stories, their dignity, their humanity. Late one night, unable to sleep, Derek found himself scrolling through the company's employee directory, the one he still had access to, for a few more days before his credentials were revoked. He looked at the names, hundreds of them, and tried to imagine the stories behind each one, the struggles, the triumphs, the quiet lives being lived in the margins of his ambition. He stopped on Marcus Thompson, the security guard. On impulse, Derek sent him an email. "Marcus, I wanted to reach out and apologize for the chaos of the past few weeks. I also wanted to thank you for the kindness you showed to Frank Miller during his time here. He mentioned it specifically, and it clearly meant a great deal to him. In my rush to optimize and restructure, I forgot that small kindnesses are what make a workplace and a life worth having. I'm sorry I didn't see that sooner. I hope you'll continue to treat people with the dignity and respect you showed, Frank. The company is lucky to have you. Derek." He hit send before he could second-guess himself, then closed his laptop and sat in the darkness of his expensive apartment, wondering what came next for a man who had lost everything and was only just beginning to understand why. 3 weeks after Frank Miller was fired from his job as a janitor, he stood on a residential street in Portland, Oregon, looking at a modest 2-story house with a well-maintained garden and a porch swing that swayed gently in the autumn breeze. Colonel Hendricks stood beside him, along with 2 agents who would remain nearby, but out of sight. "She's inside," Hendricks said quietly. "Her children are with her for support. They know the basics, that you're alive, that you were in witness protection, that you testified against dangerous people and had to disappear. But the details, the emotional weight of it all, that's for you to share." Frank nodded, his heart pounding in a way it hadn't in decades. He had faced down international espionage networks, had testified against people who would have killed him without hesitation, had lived in hiding for over 20 years. But nothing had prepared him for this moment. Walking up to his daughter's door and asking her to forgive him for being dead. "I'll be right here," Hendricks said. "Take all the time you need." Frank walked slowly up the path, each step feeling like a mile. He climbed the 3 stairs to the porch, raised his hand to knock, and paused. Through the window, he could see movement inside. Shadows of people preparing for a moment that would change everything. He knocked. The door opened, and Sarah stood there, her grey eyes wide with emotions too complex to name. She looked at him, really looked at him, and Frank saw recognition dawn, followed by disbelief, followed by something that might have been hope. "Dad?" Her voice broke on the word. "Hello, sweetheart." Frank's own voice was thick with tears he had held back for 22 years. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." And then she was in his arms, sobbing against his shoulder, and Frank held his daughter for the first time in over 2 decades, feeling the weight of all those lost years and the fragile, precious gift of this moment. Behind her, he could see 3 young adults, his grandchildren, strangers with his blood, watching with expressions of wonder and confusion and cautious hope. "You're alive," Sarah kept saying over and over. "You're alive. You're really alive." "I'm alive," Frank confirmed, his own tears falling freely now. "And I'm here, and I'm never disappearing again." They stood there on the porch, father and daughter reunited after an impossible absence, while the autumn leaves fell around them, and the world continued its indifferent turning. Inside, there would be questions, there would be explanations, and anger and grief for the years stolen from them. There would be the hard work of rebuilding trust and forging new relationships with grandchildren who had never known him. But for now, there was this: a father holding his daughter, a man reclaiming his name, a ghost stepping back into the light. Colonel Hendricks watched from the street, a slight smile on his weathered face. He had seen a lot of endings in his career, some happy, many tragic, most somewhere in between. But this one, he thought, was as close to redemption as the world usually offered. Inside the house, as Sarah led Frank to the living room where her children waited, she turned to him with eyes that held both love and pain. "Why didn't you tell me? Why did you let me think you were dead?" Frank took her hands in his, feeling how much they resembled her mother's. "Because if they had known I was alive, they would have used you to get to me. They would have hurt you, threatened you, maybe worse. The only way to keep you safe was to let you grieve and move on. It was the hardest thing I've ever done, Sarah. Every day for 22 years, I wanted to reach out, to let you know I was thinking of you, but I couldn't. Your safety was more important than my pain." "Our pain," Sarah corrected gently. "It was our pain, Dad. Mine and yours and Mum's before she died. We all paid the price for your courage. I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." One of the young men, Frank's oldest grandson, he realized, spoke up. "Grandpa." The word sounded strange, tentative, like he was trying it on for the first time. "What you did, testifying against those people, was it worth it? Worth losing all this time with us?" Frank looked at this young man who carried his genes but not his memories, and chose his words carefully. "I don't know if worth it is the right way to think about it. I made a choice to do what I believed was right, knowing what it would cost me, and it cost me everything. But the alternative was to stay silent while people died because of information I could have exposed. I couldn't live with that. So I made the choice, and I've lived with the consequences." He paused, his voice growing softer. "But if I could go back, if I could find a way to do the right thing without losing all of you, I would, in a heartbeat." They talked for hours, Frank answering questions, sharing stories, trying to compress 22 years of absence into a single afternoon. His grandchildren, Michael, Emma and Sophie, gradually warmed to him, their initial wariness giving way to curiosity and eventually a tentative affection. Sarah cried several times, working through layers of grief and relief and anger that couldn't be resolved in one day, but could at least begin to be acknowledged. As evening fell and the conversation finally wound down, Sarah walked Frank to the door. Hendrix was still waiting outside, patient and professional. "Will you come back?" Sarah asked, her hand on her father's arm. "Tomorrow? We have so much more to talk about, so many years to catch up on. Every day, if you'll have me," Frank promised. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart. I'm done running. I'm done hiding. I'm just here, for as long as you want me." She hugged him again, tighter this time. "I want you here forever, Dad. We all do." Frank left his daughter's house with a lightness in his chest he hadn't felt in decades. The weight of invisibility, of constant vigilance, of living a lie, all of it had lifted. He was Frank Miller, yes, but he was also Franklin James Miller, father and grandfather, veteran and patriot, a man with a story that mattered. As Hendrix drove him to the secure apartment they had set up in Portland, Frank looked out at the city lights and allowed himself to imagine a future. Dinners with his daughter, birthdays with his grandchildren, the simple, ordinary moments that made up a life. He was 80 years old, and he had been given a gift he never expected, a second chance. "You did good, Frank," Hendrix said quietly. "Not just today, all of it. The testimony, the years in protection, the grace you showed to that CEO. You did good. I just did what needed to be done," Frank replied. "Same as always. That's what makes you a good man. You do what needs to be done, even when it costs you everything." They drove in comfortable silence. Two old warriors who had seen too much and carried too many secrets, but who had also witnessed moments of grace that made the burden bearable. Back in the city, Derek Calloway received an email from Marcus Thompson. It was brief, but it carried a weight that Derek felt in his chest. Mr. Calloway, thank you for your message. Mr. Miller was a good man, and I'm glad I could show him some kindness. I heard he's been reunited with his family. That's good news. As for you, I hope you find your way forward. We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after. Marcus Derek read the message 3 times, then saved it. He had lost his job, his reputation, his carefully constructed career, but he had gained something more valuable, an understanding of what actually mattered. He didn't know what came next for him, but he knew it would be different. It had to be. He opened his laptop and began to write. Not a business plan or a strategy document, but something simpler and more honest. A letter to Frank Miller, thanking him for his grace, apologizing for his blindness, and promising to do better. He didn't know if Frank would ever read it, but he needed to write it anyway. If you believe every life holds a story worth remembering, subscribe to this channel and join our community. Months passed. Frank settled into his new life in Portland, spending his days with Sarah and his grandchildren, slowly building relationships that had been stolen from him. He told them stories about their grandmother, about his years in intelligence, about the choice he had made, and the price he had paid. They listened, and gradually the stranger became family. Michael, his oldest grandson, was studying criminal justice. He asked Frank endless questions about his work, about the moral complexities of espionage, about how you know when the cost of doing right becomes too high. Frank answered honestly, never sugarcoating the difficulty of the choices he had made. Emma, the middle grandchild, was an artist. She asked if she could paint his portrait, and Frank agreed. He sat for hours while she worked, and when she finally showed him the finished piece, he saw himself reflected not as the invisible janitor or the hidden witness, but as a man with dignity and history and worth. He wept when he saw it. Sophie, the youngest, simply wanted to know him. She asked about his favorite foods, his favorite books, the small details that made up a life, and Frank, who had spent so long being no one, discovered the profound joy of being known. Sarah struggled at times with the anger and grief she had carried for so many years. She went to therapy, worked through the complicated emotions of having a father return from the dead, but she also made room for him in her life, inviting him to family dinners, including him in holiday celebrations, slowly weaving him back into the fabric of their family. One evening, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset, Sarah asked the question Frank had been waiting for. Do you regret it? The testimony, the years in hiding, all of it. Frank thought carefully before answering. I regret what it cost me. I regret missing your life, missing my grandchildren's childhoods. I regret that your mother died thinking I was already gone. Those regrets will stay with me until I die. He paused, watching the sky turn orange and purple. But I don't regret the choice itself. People were dying because of information I could expose. I had the power to stop it, and I used that power. If I had stayed silent, I don't think I could have lived with myself. Even knowing what you'd lose, even knowing that. Frank took his daughter's hand. But Sarah, I want you to understand something. I don't expect you to be proud of what I did. I don't expect you to think it was worth it. You paid a price you never agreed to pay. Your anger, your grief, they're valid, they're real. And I'll spend whatever time I have left trying to make amends for the years I stole from you. Sarah leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat together in the gathering darkness. Two people learning how to be family again. In the city, Derek Calloway had taken a job at a non-profit organization that helped veterans transition to civilian life. It was a far cry from his corner office and 6-figure salary, but it was meaningful in ways his previous work had never been. He listened to stories of service and sacrifice, of men and women who had given everything for their country and received little in return. And he thought about Frank Miller, the invisible janitor who had been a hero all along. One day, Derek received a letter. It was postmarked from Portland, and the return address was unfamiliar. He opened it with trembling hands. "Mr. Calloway, I received your letter, and I want you to know that I appreciate your words. More importantly, I appreciate that you seem to have learned from what happened. I've heard about your new work with veterans, and I'm glad you found a way to serve that matters. We all make mistakes. What defines us is not the mistakes themselves, but how we respond to them. You responded with humility and a genuine desire to change. That takes courage. I hope you'll continue on this path. The world needs people who can see beyond the spreadsheets and recognize the humanity in everyone they encounter. Keep doing that work, Mr. Calloway. It matters more than you know. Frank Miller." Derek read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in his desk drawer. It was a small thing, a few words on paper, but it felt like absolution, like permission to move forward without the crushing weight of shame he had carried for months. He returned to his work with renewed purpose, determined to honor the grace Frank had shown him by extending that same grace to others. Years passed. Frank Miller lived to see his grandchildren graduate from college, watched Emma's art career flourish, attended Michael's wedding, held Sophie's first child, his great-granddaughter, in his arms. He lived openly, using his real name, no longer hiding in the shadows. There were moments when the old vigilance returned, when he caught himself scanning crowds for threats that no longer existed. But mostly, he lived, really lived in ways he had forgotten were possible. On his 85th birthday, Sarah threw him a party. His grandchildren were there, along with their partners and children. Colonel Hendricks came, retired now, but still carrying himself like a soldier. Even Marcus Thompson, the security guard from the office building, attended, having stayed in touch with Frank over the years. As Frank looked around the room at the faces of people who knew him, who loved him, who had made space for him in their lives, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. He had lost so much, years he could never reclaim, moments he could never recreate, but he had also gained something precious, the chance to be himself, to be known, to matter. Derek Calloway sent a card. It was simple, just a few lines wishing Frank a happy birthday and thanking him again for the lesson in humanity he had taught. Frank smiled when he read it and made a mental note to respond. That night, as the party wound down and the guests began to leave, Sarah sat beside her father on the porch swing, the same one where they had sat on that first impossible day when he had returned from the dead. "Happy birthday, Dad," she said softly. "Thank you, sweetheart. This was perfect. Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if you hadn't testified? If you had stayed silent and kept your normal life?" Frank considered the question. "Sometimes, but I think I would have been a different person, a lesser person. The choice I made defined me in ways I'm still discovering. It cost me everything, but it also gave me a kind of clarity about what matters, about who I want to be. And who's that? Someone who does the right thing, even when it's hard, even when it costs everything. Because at the end of the day, that's all we really have. The choices we make and the integrity we bring to them." Sarah squeezed his hand. "I'm proud of you, Dad. I'm angry about the years we lost, and I'll probably always carry some of that grief, but I'm proud of you, of your courage, of your sacrifice, of the man you are." Frank felt tears prick his eyes. "That means more to me than you know." They sat together in the gathering darkness, father and daughter, connected by blood and loss and love and the strange winding path that had brought them back to each other. The world continued its indifferent turning, but here, on this porch, in this moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Frank Miller had been invisible for 22 years. He had been fired from his job at 80 years old by a young CEO who saw him as nothing more than an expendable resource. That firing had triggered a federal crisis, exposed a classified protection program, and nearly cost Frank his life. But it had also set him free, free to reclaim his name, free to reunite with his family, free to step out of the shadows and into the light, free to be, finally and completely, himself. And in the end, that freedom was worth everything he had paid for it. Indeed.